Hi Nine, welcome to lesson 5. As like before, we've got 5 quick-fire questions just to check how much you can remember from last week's lesson on China. So pause the video and have a go at answering these 5 questions on a scrap bit of paper. So here is an example of a completed one from last week. Just pause the video in a sec and double check that you've got as much detail in all of your boxes as there is on here. If you're missing anything, then make sure that it is fully completed. You can use some of these as an example, or you can just double check your answers to make sure that you've got all the correct information down. Obviously, with things like ecosystems, you might have picked a different ecosystem, but that's just to give you an idea of how much detail that we're looking for in each of these sections. So moving on then, today's country we are focusing on is Australia. So just like before, you're going to need a fact book, a pen and some scrap paper. And I thought to start this off a little bit differently is I want you to write down everything that you know about Australia. So this might be particular places or cities that you've heard about. It could be animals associated with the country, different areas that you've heard of in Australia, some random facts about the people, about the products that you can find there, anything that you know about Australia. So see if you can get between maybe 5 or 10 different things. Okay, hopefully you've come up with a few ideas. You might be able to put those in your random facts section and they might come up as topics that we're covering in this week's lesson. So as always, I want us to start by understanding whereabouts Australia is and writing our description using clock. Now, this week I've removed what each of those 5 letters stand for, hoping that you can remember because this will be the 5th time that we've done it. So can you try and write a description for Australia using these 5 different letters that the clock stands for? To help you out, I've labelled where the Tropic of Capricorn is, and also you've got the equator to the north of Australia running through Indonesia if you're not sure where the lines of latitude are. So pause the video and have a go writing a few sentences using this clock idea of where Australia is located. So to have a look at some of the things that you should have included in your answer. So the first C stands for compass points, that's your north, east, south and west. The L stands for lines of latitude, so hopefully you've included the Tropic of Capricorn in your answer. The O stands for oceans or seas. Then one of the C's at the end stands for countries and the other one stands for continents. So Australia is located in the continent of Oceania. You might have learned that it's called Australasia as well, but sort of the more modern and up-to-date term is Oceania. As I mentioned before, lines of latitude, we've got the Tropic of Capricorn that runs through Australia. In terms of oceans, we've got the South Pacific Ocean to the east of Australia, so trying to use our compass points in there. And then countries that are nearby, there's quite a few on the map, but you could have included New Zealand and Papua New Guinea. So if you could say Papua New Guinea is to the north of Australia and New Zealand's to the southeast of Australia. So have a look back at your answer and make sure that all of those 5 ideas you've included in your description of Australia. So if we move on and look at climate then, I found this image that shows you a range of different climates that you can find across the country of Australia. And on the right hand side of your screen, I've given you a bit of an example of how you might want to start that paragraph in your fact book and then some sentence starters to help you. So I thought it could be quite useful to compare 2 different climates that you can find there. You might decide to just focus on one in particular. I'll leave that up to you. So I would start by saying something like Australia is a large country and has a range of climates. One example is the desert. And then I might try and find a climate graph that tells me about the different temperatures and the amount of rainfall for the desert. I then could contrast it with the climate in Sydney. Now Sydney is on the east coast of Australia, so you'd expect to find some differences there with a more coastal area. So I would then try and find a climate graph for Sydney and look at the temperatures and rainfall there as well. So have a go now at either comparing 2 different climates or just focusing on one but doing a little bit more detail on that one. Also, if you wanted to, hopefully you remember at the start of the year there were some really bad fires in Australia. So you could look into what caused the bushfires, how that's linked to climate. Is it linked to climate change? What's going to be happening in the future? What's happened since the fires? To sort of get a bit of an update and understand how climate comes into the bushfires that Australia experiences, if you're interested. Okay, next up is ecosystems. And for this week, I've decided for you guys to focus on the Great Barrier Reef. Hopefully you might have heard of this before, features in films like Finding Nemo and stuff like that. And the Great Barrier Reef is the biggest coral reef in the world. It's where there's loads and loads of different types of fish, different types of mammals like whales and dolphins you'll find there as well as really, really interesting plant life. So I've linked a YouTube video here that if you could go and watch and write some notes and fill in that section of your fact book all about the Great Barrier Reef. There might be some other videos linked to that as you start watching it. Feel free to watch other ones. This is one that I found that's particularly useful and covers a lot of different information, but feel free to sort of explore YouTube and find out other stuff to do with the Barrier Reef as well, to build up a really good case study of that as an ecosystem. Okay, next up are key facts all about Australia. So at the top I've given you a link which I used last week as well with China. So it's the World Bank website, and then you just change the end bit of the website to Australia to find out Australia specific ones. So just a few highlights. Australia's population is increasing, and actually Australia is a really, really huge country, and you'd expect more people to live there because of the size of it, but because so much of it is desert, like you saw from the climate section earlier, a lot of people can't live towards the centre of Australia, so most people live around the coastal areas, especially around the east coast, so they actually don't have that bigger population for the size of the country. Life expectancy is higher than the UK and the US, and this is increasing. Land area, as I mentioned, it's the 6th largest in the world, so a really, really big country. And in terms of its development ranking, it's ranked 6th in the world, and that's the same as Iceland. So really, really well-developed country is Australia. So using the website at the top, or if you've been using other ones for the other lessons, those that were mentioned in your fact book, find out all the other bits and pieces to fill in that section of your fact book. Okay, if we go on and look at trade then. So again, at the top here, I've put a website which lists all the different things that Australia imports and exports, and I've included a few on this slide, but I'd maybe encourage you to go and look at that website as well to add a few more to your fact books, as well as sort of understand what they mean when they talk about things like machinery and vehicles. They're quite general terms. What do they actually mean by that? So some of the top imports are things like vehicles, pharmaceuticals, which is medicine, and furniture, bedding and lighting. And then some of the top exports include things like crude oil. So oil is a really, really valuable resource. You often think of it as being an energy source and being used in cars, which absolutely is, but oil is used for so many other things, like it's used to make everything out of plastic as well. And 75% of that is created in Australia is exported. So they actually only use 25% of what they make there. So they have a huge supply of crude oil that they ship, I think, largely to Asia, to places like China and things like that. They also export a lot of meat because obviously it's a big country. So they've got lots of land for agriculture and raising animals. And then cereals as well, not cereals as in like Rice Krispies, Weetabix, the things that are actually used to make those. So wheat and barley and oats and things like that. Oh, and another import is machinery as well. So you can use some of mine as a bit of an idea, but definitely go onto this website and look for a bit more detail of what we mean by some of those things. And you might want to switch them out and add in some others that you find more interesting on there too. Okay, if we look at industry and multinationals, then. So, Australia's a high income country, it's very well developed, we know that from previous info. So, you would expect the industry, the economic sectors to look something like this. So, the majority of people working in the tertiary sector, far, far fewer people working in the primary sector. So, here's a breakdown of the percentages if you want to write those down in your fact book to start off with. Okay, and if we move on to the multinationals, then I've done something a bit different this week. So I'm going to show you a few different companies, and I want you to decide whether you think that they are an Australian company or whether they're another international company that have sort of offices and bases in Australia. So the first one is Qantas. So they're a really, really huge airline company that obviously offer flights to Australia as well as other places in the world. So where do you think? Do you think they're an Australian company, or do you think they're from elsewhere but have a base in Australia? So Qantas is an Australian multinational. It's their biggest airline, I would say. Okay, next up is BP. BP are an oil firm. You've probably seen petrol stations out and about. So do you think that they are an Australian company or that they're from elsewhere but have offices and things in Australia? So BP actually stands for British Petroleum. So BP is not an Australian company. Okay, Mars then. So Mars are known as being a confectionery company, but also hopefully you know that there's Mars in Melton Mowbray that deal with sort of pet food and pet care. So they're a really, really big multinational company, but are they from Australia or are they from elsewhere but have bases in Australia? Okay, so Mars are also an international company. I think they're American, but have bases in Australia too. Okay, next up is Billabong, which are a clothing brand famously known for sort of surfwear and being a surfing company. So do you think that they are Australian or a multinational that's based in Australia? Okay, so Billabong is an Australian company, being a surfing brand. I'm assuming that they're kind of set up to support all those people that are really, really big into surfing in Australia. Okay, next up is Bupa, who are a private healthcare company. You might have seen adverts for them in the UK. We definitely have Bupa hospitals here in the UK, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not an Australian company. So what do you think, that they're Australian or that they're a multinational based in Australia? Okay, so Bupa aren't Australian. Again, I think that they're British. However, they do have Bupa clinics and hospitals in Australia too. Okay, finally then, Foster's. So Foster's are a sort of beer lager company, but they also are a bit bigger than that, and they have lots and lots of drinks under their sort of Foster's label. So do you think that they are an Australian company, or do you think that they're a multinational that's based in Australia? Okay, if you've ever seen Foster's adverts on the TV, then they often have sort of an Australian accent doing the voiceovers for them. So they are an Australian company, but you'll be able to find Foster's in pubs and supermarkets here as well. So they're a really, really big multinational. So using some of these ideas, you can also do some extra research to find out other Australian multinationals or multinationals that have bases in Australia to fill in that section of your fact book. Okay, and finally, then we're going to look at global cities. So, does Australia have any? Yes, it actually has two, Sydney being the biggest one, although Sydney isn't the capital of Australia, Canberra is. A lot of people get that confused, but Sydney is not the capital. And Melbourne is also another major city of Australia. But I'm going to ask you this week to focus on Sydney because this is one that when we study more at GCSE, it comes up as a bit of a case study for a global city. So, what I want you to do is have a look on the internet. I'll share the link with you below. But there's this sort of campaign around Sustainable Sydney 2030, and they're trying to implement things to make it an even better global city and ensure that it's sustainable. So, their sort of slogan is green, global, and connected. So, green, thinking about maybe green spaces and making sure that it's environmentally friendly. global, sort of making sure that lots of different nations can be involved, whether that be in trade or communication, and similarly making sure that they're connected through maybe transport and education and other things that we've looked at through Global Cities. So here is another short YouTube video, I think it's maybe 2 or 3 minutes, where the Mayor of Sydney is kind of explaining a lot of the different things that they're implementing in Sydney to make it an even better global city. So look through that to start off with, would be my top tip, and write down as much as you can in your fact book box around Sydney being a global city based on that video. If you still want a bit more information, here's the website that tells you a bit more about what they're doing. So if you're struggling to use that as a link, if you just type in City of Sydney into Google, and then when you get to that website, you click on where it says Learn, there's some tabs along the top, and then it comes up as Global City, and then you just click on that to find out a bit more information about what they're doing. So make sure you watch the YouTube video to start off with about Sustainable Sydney 2030, and then if you still want to find out some more information or you don't feel like you've got enough from that video, then click on that website as well. Okay, and finally we're on to our interesting facts. So you might have picked up things from maybe the Great Barrier Reef video, or from the things that you started off by writing down at the start of today's lesson that we've not covered that you want to include in your interesting facts. That's completely fine. Here are a few that I found out to share with you. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, Canberra is actually the capital of Australia, not Sydney. Uluru is in the centre of the country and is the largest standing rock in the world. If you don't know what Uluru is, or you've never heard of it, then definitely Google it. It's this huge sort of orange rock in the middle of Australia that has a lot of significance for Australian Aborigines, which are the indigenous people there. 90% of Australians live on the coast because of the deserts in the centre. Again, I mentioned that earlier, that a lot of the population are around the edge. If you look at where Sydney and Melbourne, Perth, Cairn, all the major cities are around the coast of Australia. Australian Alps receives more snow than the Swiss Alps. So these are places that you might be able to ski or snowboard, mountainous areas that receive a lot of snow. And Australia is home to 10 of the world's 15 most poisonous snakes, which fills me with dread because snakes, I absolutely hate snakes and petrified of them. So I would not want to come into contact with any of those. So do some research. As I say, you might have picked things up throughout today's lesson that you can add into that section of your fact book, or you can use a few of mine to make sure that that part is completed. So what do you need to do next? Well, you need to make sure that each section of your fact sheets are as complete as possible. Remember to go back to the start of this one and double check the China one to see what we're kind of expecting in terms of the level of detail. Then try and read through and learn all the information you've gathered about Australia. Like before, if there's anyone at home that could test this knowledge, that would be really, really useful. As this is your last lesson of Year 9, I hope you guys have a great summer holidays and look forward to seeing you all again at the end of August. Bye.